Marwan, a radically different format has been announced at this press conference to the direct talks that were Geneva and the proximity talks before between two sides. Why has Staffan de Mistura been pushed to make this hugely different announcement?
Look, clearly we have a process that has been intensifying, a diplomatic process, since October 30th, when they first met in Europe, the United States and Russia, and then later on November 14, and then Kerry invited Lavrov to the United Nations in the end of December, the second part of December, and there where they agreed to UN resolution, UN Security Council resolution 2254. Clearly, throughout this 2 months process and through today, there's a realignment of the American position with the Russian position, and that's where de Mistura falls. He falls on this realignment of basically the Americans moving closer to the Russians on the question of the opposition, on the questions of negotiations, and on the questions of de Mistura. Because for the first time in the history of these negotiations, United Nations Council Resolution 2254 on the assistance of the Russians designated de Mistura as the person who had this leeway of basically defining who will negotiate with the Syrian government come 29th.
Are we again then seeing the Russians leaning on de Mistura, getting more opposition groups involved than initially, for example, the Saudis wanted?
Clearly, and not only that. Remember, it was a bit a while ago, three years ago, that the United States and others, the so-called international community, called the Syrian National Coalition the sole representative of the Syrian people. We've come a long way since then. Suddenly, after the Russians intervened militarily on September 30th, was it now 4 or 5 months ago, in Syria, and the bombardment started, and the bombardment continues by the Russians in order to effect the negotiations. Certainly the Americans, pragmatic as they are, have come around to agree with the Russians on a Russian resolution, because 2254 was a draft Russian resolution that, by the way, was rejected by Saudi Arabia, was rejected by Turkey, as well as Qatar and others. They've rejected 2254. But the United States, nonetheless, insisted on going along with the Russians, who already have a huge military presence there. And de Mistura, in so many ways, as a seasoned diplomat, is speaking out of that sort of realignment between Washington and Moscow.
The Russians had a point, though, didn't they? It was saying that there were too many fighters in the opposition at the talks. There weren't enough secularists, for example. There weren't the Kurds there. I mean, they were excluded from the initial list.
In Riyadh, well, I'm not going to call it the miracle. We're exaggerating here. Anyway, the success of Riyadh. Because in America, in the sense of considering the very tough conditions in Syria, the death of hundreds of thousands and so forth, to have people come to Riyadh, and who came to Riyadh? There are Kurds, there are communists, secularists, women, men, Islamists, liberals, and fighters on the ground. So we have the two main fighting groups that are not considered terrorists by the international community or by the European Geneva and Vienna, which is Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham. These are the two main fighting groups on the ground in Syria within the general opposition. Those who are notably Islamists turned up in Riyadh and agreed to a democratic state, enshrined with human rights and so on and so forth. They've agreed to that communique that established a united opposition that will go to as a delegation to the negotiations. So we actually, in Riyadh, something spectacular happened. Now, for de Mistura to come back again now and say, well, I'm going to have several rooms. I'm going to be talking to these first and those third and on. And the government is the government. The government still rules in Damascus. The war basically continues, and it's being legitimized more and more through the Russian bombardment that is going on in Syria with a new American alignment with the Russian position. So really, when I look at this, I can see how it's a slippery slope. I can see how de Mistura is being overly pragmatic, as sincere as he might be.
But did he have a choice? I mean, you had the Riyadh group saying they wouldn't come to the talks without these preconditions, the ceasefire, the humanitarian aid. Those weren't happening anyway, so would they have come to the talks anyway?
But these are actually UN Security Council resolution mandated conditions.
Sure.
That there has to be some sort of a ceasefire, some sort of a humanitarian assistance, because you can't expect the people to go to negotiate with a regime that continues to incarcerate them, continues to kill them, and continues to starve them. So the United Nations Security Council resolution, in fact, mandated that. So the Syrian opposition is within its rights to say, look, before we go and talk to a regime that we consider murderer, etc., let's at least have some fruits, you know, before we get there. Anyway, this is not happening, and clearly we have some shortcuts here. But fundamentally, what is quite surprising, not shocking, but surprising, and I'm not sure how the Syrian opposition is going to be reacting later on this evening. I'm really looking with very, you know, impatience, if you will, because if I heard them correctly, and I saw a number of them here in Doha before, they said in every possible clear wording, they will not go to negotiations if there's going to be more than one delegation.
And now there's every delegation.
And now we will see, yes.
Will there be too many voices at these talks? Is it too crowded now? I mean, we have Staffan de Mistura saying he's going to be shuttling between, he doesn't even know how many rooms at this stage.
You know, just as on a personal note, if you will, I've met de Mistura before he came, the United Nations or the international community's envoy to Syria, and I met him in Rome, and he actually asked for the thing, and we sat down and we talked about various things, and you can tell de Mistura is the kind of guy he's proud to speak Arabic, he's proud to know the region, he is a seasoned diplomat, and clearly he has started his interest in Syria. And one thing you know about de Mistura is he's a very charming diplomat, and he's probably more than willing to talk to civil society and to women group and so on and so forth. But in the end of the day, is that the real nuggets and axes of power in Syria? I mean, to have some kind of a discussion about different groups, about their wishes? Because at the end of the day, the Syrian government is the one that's coming now with basically blood and fire to these talks and saying, governance, well, look, we have just changed our constitution. Elections, we just had elections. So whatever you're asking, we as a regime have already started this thing. It's going to be very hard to pinpoint some of these issues that are crucial to the opposition, that are crucial to the Syrian people. If de Mistura is going to carry these generalistic, abstract, over months of negotiations of proximity, it doesn't sound to me like the serious negotiations we were promised in Geneva 1 or 2.
But it is what we've got right now.
It is what we've got.